Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Have you ever wanted to be a woman senator? Well, I haven't, but I have a lot of curiosity about what it would be like. And if you have such fantasies, just hang on. I've got some people here who can share some things with you. I have 3 women friends who are going to tell us all about what it's like to be a senator in Canada. I suppose it may differ from one country to another quite a bit, but at any rate, Canadian senators have a lot of opportunity to do very constructive things, and the women take the most advantage of that, in my impression. So we're going to start with Senator Mary Lou McPhedran, who is actually in Vienna. And I want to say hello to Mary Lou, and to say that you're going to be telling us a little bit about what is going on at the TPNW meeting, right? Say a little bit about what the TPNW is, and then I'll go to Lois.
Okay, so in January of 2021, the newest treaty dealing with disarmament was activated, and it is the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which makes it very different from the other treaty, which is about non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, and has been demonstrated pretty clearly not to have succeeded in its goals. This is a treaty that was greatly and continues to be greatly resisted by the nuclear states, and there is an absence of them at this UN meeting, but this is the first meeting of the states parties, so the countries that have ratified this new treaty. And this is a gathering to talk about what has been happening under the new treaty. So it's been basically a year, and what needs to happen in as we go forward. I'm here with a newly formed group called Parliamentarians for TPNW, standing for the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We issued a statement here at the UN in Vienna yesterday, and many of us have stayed to be involved in various discussions. There are a number of bilaterals, talking with other countries. In my case, for example, Kazakhstan, which we can certainly understand why Kazakhstan is watching the genocide in Ukraine very closely with a great deal of concern.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Senator McPhedran. And I want to mention somebody who's not here yet, but we're expecting, and that's Senator Nancy Ruth, who has, she'll be joining us in a few minutes, we think. She's been off at a doctor's appointment. So, and now let's go on, and I want to introduce everybody to Lois Wilson. Senator Lois Wilson was not only a senator, but a reverend before that. She was the, it's not the coordinator of the United Church. What's the word for it? Moderator, yes. I beg your pardon. I should know that. The moderator of the United Church of Canada. And then she was a senator for a number of years and continues to be a sort of a gadfly. She's already been telling me this morning what she's been working on a little bit. Senator Lois Wilson, tell me a little bit about what you're up to.
Well, the COVID showed us some of the economic cracks in our society and how people at the bottom are being left behind, and the liberals are all for the middle class, but they don't pay much attention to the lower class. So I was asked by the United Church to animate it on the issue of the guaranteed livable income, which was introduced first in 1972 by Senator Crowell with his landmark report on poverty. And basically, it's allowing financial support to people below the poverty line, up to $2,000 a month, with no strings attached. It's like my pension. I don't have to keep proving I'm over 65. And this would cut out a lot of the bureaucracy and the application for help. There have been 3 pilot projects in Ontario, which were going very nicely under Kathleen Wynne's government, until 18 months later, Doug Ford canceled them all. But I have the evaluation of the McMaster one, and and they're all positive. Just stay home.
Actually, I did some interviews with people who were running that program at the time, and everybody was getting so much value from it that it came as quite a shock that he just, I guess he just shut it off.
The current situation is that all parties in PEI have asked the federal government for a pilot project there for 5 years. So we're supporting that. And there are 2 motions currently, one in the Commons and one in the Senate, to support the PEI initiative and the guaranteed livable income. So we've joined that. And so that's mainly what I'm doing these days. Very interesting.
Everyone is out.
How do you do it?
We have to lock it.
Okay.
Senator McFedrin sounds, I think she's getting kicked out of the.
I am the very last person left in this hall that holds about 1,000 people. And I have now had 2 of the guards tell me very nicely that they are turning off the lights. So I will take my iPad and I will find another spot and I will sign back in. I will return.
Okay, good. Have a good time out there.
Yeah.
Okay, see you in a bit. Well, so being a senator doesn't cut any ice. When they're going to throw you out, you get thrown out anyway. Is that your experience, Lois? How much did you benefit personally from the prestige and the perks and things? Could you just sort of flaunt it, or how much personal aggrandizement could a person do who wanted to as a senator?
Well, what I appreciated is I was able to have a staff of 4 people. And in the church, I never had a staff of 1, even or half.
Really?
And so it really multiplies the work that you're able to do. And my work was, before I went into the Senate, Ursula Franklin said to me, Lois, do one thing, because you're only there for a short time. And if you don't decide what you want to do, you get pulled in 20 directions. And it was the best advice I had from anybody. I sat as an independent, which I had to negotiate with Chrétien, who was not interested in what I thought, but would I put up my hand and be voting fodder? And so I was able to establish a standing committee on human rights, which at the time, all the senators said, we can't have another committee. We've got too many committees now and it's not necessary. But I'm delighted now that it is there. And the senators are currently using it. There was a headline, senators go to jail. And the senators are currently visiting the prisons in Canada because of the Human Rights Committee. So that was my satisfaction in the Senate.
That was your goal when you went in. You were going to do one thing and that was it?
Yeah.
But I bet you got a lot more done besides that, though.
Well, it was, Canada signs all these UN covenants. We're Boy Scouts internationally, but it's never translated into domestic legislation.
Right. Oh, yeah. Okay.
So that was my issue, to educate people about that and do it through this Human Rights Committee. So I got it done. I'm very proud of that.
Okay, terrific. Now you're working on this guaranteed annual income. I don't know, that has other kinds of names, but
basic income. We work with the Basic Income Network across Canada, which is an enormous secular network. It's an organization. We're not an organization, but they're an organization, and they're very active. I mean, recently they phoned all their MPs and all their senators and have on file who supports this and who doesn't. That's why we're supporting the PEI initiative, because that would give us the data.
Is there one going on there now?
No, but as I said, all 3 parties agree that they want a demonstration project of 5 years. So it will not be canceled by an election as the one in Ontario was. And that's what we're supporting.
That's terrific. Because, there was one back in, you mentioned in the 70s, I remember that. And there was a woman named Evelyn Forget, I think, in Manitoba, who, as I recall the story, she found a box of sort of mildewy old records in a basement someplace and started looking at it. It turns out that it was a list of or a box full of research findings for somebody who was actually following up on the effectiveness of guaranteed annual income that went for a short period of time in Manitoba. And so she got these things out and she started looking at them and used these old records and did a real analysis and proved that it was extremely valuable.
That was in Dauphin, Manitoba, but the more recent ones were held in Ontario, in Thunder Bay and Lindsay and Hamilton, and they were all evaluated. And you can do the evaluations online. You can find them.
So they do have the evaluations. Okay, well, so I did a talk show with a guy named John Mills and another guy, a younger man, Tom, Cooper maybe, in Hamilton, and it was a good team because John Mills had been a businessman, a very effective person, and for some reason something happened, and he found himself jobless and broke. Yeah. And so it really was extremely important to be able to listen to somebody and find out how much his life had been improved by this having this steady source of low income, but it was enough to get by. So we had such a good conversation about that, and I thought it was going gangbusters, but then they pulled it out.
Well, we keep hearing two objections particularly about it. One is the work ethic. You only get what you work for, which is very strong. And the other is the Lady Bountiful thing. We'll have food banks instead.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a structural change they're looking at. It's just a charity model. And we're trying to move it from charity to social and economic justice.
Mm-hmm. But I think it's been demonstrated that people actually use this money in very astute ways and investing in their own future. They get trainings or they get other set up little businesses, or do they do other things that make them give them a leg up on their own economic well-being?
Yeah, they go to the doctor less often.
Really?
So the medical, I've had a psychiatric association run articles in their magazines in favor of the guaranteed livable income because of this.
Mm-hmm.
The magazine, because a psychiatrist friend keeps sending it to me, and there are articles there in favor of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, there was a study of I think some villages in Africa. And they have this wonderful system of using their cell phones there as kind of a bank. So they did a comparison between two different, or maybe it's several different villages, small villages, rural areas. And one of the villages, everybody there the whole town got a very small, it was like $50 a month or something, wasn't very much. But what happened is that every month there'd be like $50 deposited into their cell phone account, and then they can use that as they go to the store, and they can pay for it with their phone. I don't know why we don't have that, but they made the comparisons, and they found that the town that had this income, after a year or two, if you walked through the village, these two villages, you could tell the difference. Just walking through, you could see the difference in the way people lived and the quality of life that they had there. So it's really wonderful.
Well, it's still going to be a very hard sell, though, for a government to keep saying we're for the middle class.
I think the fact that during this COVID epidemic, they threw around money.
I know exactly.
Yeah.
And the GLI would consolidate some of that. And you wouldn't have to apply for it. Exactly. The money's there.
Well, they just proved that, if they could do it then, they could do it other times. I don't know why not. Yeah. Is it Nancy? Hello,
yes.
Nancy.
All right, it's Nancy Ruth, and I'm glad to be here with you two ladies.
Women senators are all progressive and feisty and good-hearted and nice folks, people I would like. But are there any nasty women?
Of course, this is about power.
Yeah, it's a slice of society. Come on, man, and get realistic.
Well, okay, so I'm not realistic. Tell me about it, Nancy. Get us caught up on. I haven't really properly introduced you. I told people that you're going to be with
Why
us.
don't I do that as I'm talking?
Sure.
I was appointed to the Senate by a Liberal prime minister because he got in trouble with Paul Martin for not appointing others than his own party. And he had a minority government. So I was appointed as a progressive conservative and joined Harper's group when he became prime minister. And being part of government was a real key for me. I mean, it meant I got to talk to cabinet ministers every week. I was part of the caucus. I knew some of what was going on. It gave me access that I would not have had in this independent Senate that there now is, or as Lois was when she was there as an independent. Having access to cabinet ministers meant on the QT, you could push particular things. And you could speak to the prime minister every week. And that was really quite wonderful. And for me, in particular, when the trans bill was brought in, and it included trans in the hate section of the criminal code, sections 318 and 19.
Well, you're going to have
included women.
Hold on, you got to fill me in on this because I haven't followed that. You have to forgive me, ladies, because I have not been as active as a feminist as you would want. So you're going to have to tell me some things that I didn't know, like what is this bill?
Well, this was a bill that allows gender identity in Canada. There's nothing wrong with that bill. But one of the things it did was that in the hate section of the criminal code, it prohibited hatred against trans. But women were not included in that bill. And as hard as I might with opposition parties, I could not get the NDP, whose bill it was, or the Liberals, who at that time only had something like 3 members. I don't know, they were almost out of Parliament. None of the women's critics would include the word sex. And the reason sex had not been initially included in that part of the criminal code was because they were afraid that all feminists would then use that section to sue the government or companies or whoever on the issue of pornography. However, it was untenable for me that another grounds could be added to the hate section without including women, i.e. the category sex. And I got nowhere. I mean, one of the things about senators is they do have some capacity to work across party lines. And that's one of the good things, I think. But I was not successful in that instance of working across party lines. And I had to go to the prime minister and tell him the problem that I was having with the bill and that me, his wife, and his daughter needed to be in there. And he put us in there. Now, it was not my expectation that the Conservatives would have done that. But indeed, they did when all the other parties.
This was Harper.
This was Harper.
Okay,
So,
I'll give him a credit.
That's one of the good things.
Okay.
So sometimes working across party lines works for you and sometimes it doesn't.
Okay, now tell me what's in this hate bill, because I'm sorry, but what would get me in trouble if I did it? If I were hateful?
It'd be part of the criminal code. You'd be charged. I'm just going to put some lights on so I
Okay.
can see you all better.
Sure.
That is something you should understand. Is I was at a
There
very
we go, Martha. There we go.
Yeah, Lois was saying something. Mhm.
I was only there for 4 years, so I knew my time was very limited. And that's why I sat as an independent, knowing that I had particular things I wanted to get through. If I'd had longer, I think I would have made a different choice. But I was only there for such a short time. And for me, it worked very well.
Well,
And it was
tell me
very
about this.
significant that Lois brought in the Human Rights Committee. I mean, that's one of the things I think
Uh-huh.
that she's most commendable for within the Senate. And that committee has struggled with issues like women, peace and security, raising those issues with the military when they didn't want to hear it. And, we'd ask, what kind of training do the soldiers get on, let's say in those days, it was 1325. And they'd say half an hour. that was not really good enough. And so it gave committees and senators some knowledge to know that they could go back at the military to the Defense Committee and just keep at it. And I think water on a stone is a bit what senators do. And I'm sure Mary Lou McPhedran is one of those senators now who does it regularly.
Welcome back, Mary Lou. You found a place to put up your laptop outside or what?
No, I'm talking to you on my phone in a taxi now. They kicked me totally out of the UN. So.
Oh my goodness. And you're in a taxi.
I hope you can hear me okay. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay.
Okay.
First time I think I've ever talked to anybody from the rear seat of a taxi. But
well, I'm now getting out. I'm going to go on mute.
You're going to find another place to plug it in. Good. Okay, I'll see you in a minute. I want to go back to Nancy Ruth and get a little more information about what this bill, what this hate bill was. And what is it they outlawed? You know, and I don't have a very clear set of priorities, you know, but I sort of believe in civil liberties, and I'm pretty open about speech. So I don't. Maybe you can clarify what my own.
You're not allowed to give speeches that are anti-Semitic without being charged with hate. That is this section of the criminal code. And so it applies to other categories. You can't do it for disability. You can't do it for age. You can't do it on the grounds of sex, trans. I'd have to read the code to itemize them all, but they're similar to the grounds in section 15 of the charter.
So how do they tell whether something is hate or not?
Well, you can go to court and someone will tell you that.
Do you think there's any, I mean, maybe there's no problem. Maybe,
I don't believe in the freedom of speech in this country. And I think the truckers and all that business about freedom is just absolute rubbish. I also think the CBC should be condemned for not bothering to teach the Canadian public that in Canada, all rights, all freedoms are limited by Section 1 of the Charter. Is it reasonable in a free and democratic society to whatever? We do not have absolute freedoms here, and this Americanization of the Canadian Charter is rubbish. And the CBC should be well slapped for broadcasting nothing different.
Okay. Well, that's what I mean. On a day when I haven't planned what we're going to say, we sometimes find ourselves talking about something we don't know anything about. And this is one of those times. I'm thinking about something like a couple of months ago, Wendy Mesley got fired from the CBC for using a word which apparently was simply the title of a book. It was called White Niggers of America. It was a very famous book that I once read back in the 70s. She referred to that book title and she got fired. And I wrote a letter to the Globe. It didn't get published. Of course, they wouldn't publish anything like that. Okay, do you think she should have been fired for mentioning the title of that book?
I don't think a person should be fired for quoting the title of a book. No, I do not. In this particular case, I had no idea what the context is, and everything has a context.
Okay.
I support Nancy Ruth in saying there are some limits to free speech. I mean, you're not allowed to cry out fire in a crowded theater, for example. I mean, there are limits to free speech, and that's not being heard in Canada these days.
Okay. I have.
I can maybe.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Oh, you're back.
Can you hear me? I am now in the hotel bar, but there's nobody else here yet, so it's nice and quiet. We'll try this. Third time lucky. I'd like to share an anecdote with you on this very point. I was censored for my very first speech in the Senate. And in that speech, I spoke about exactly the points that both Lois and Nance have just made in terms of limitations on freedoms, but I focused my comments on othering And I drew an observation that I experienced quite a lot of othering as a newcomer to that chamber, and that I felt that it often wasn't conscious. And I spoke about some very particular examples that I had heard where there was tone of voice, there was differentiation, saying always they or those people or that kind of othering. And
meaning, in what way were you part of this other? Was it for being a woman senator, or what was it?
No, othering is a term, is part of this expanding category, if you will, of language that is not considered acceptable, is considered to be an aggression or a microaggression, or and I was trying to speak to that, but I gave some examples of words that we use to describe certain people, including women, and I said them out loud. And I one of those words was the N-word, and one of my colleagues, who was actually sworn in on the same day that I was, so we were both relative newcomers, who is one of the Black senators, came up to me afterwards, and she said to me, "If this had not been your first speech, I would have risen on a point of order and asked for your expulsion on the basis of your using the N-word." That surprised me, but I felt that as a person who is not a Black person, that if a Black colleague came to me and said that that's how strongly and clearly they felt about any mention of that word, then I needed to change the way I was using language. You asked a different question. You asked about being fired as a result of that. I don't know the details of the case. On the surface, it certainly looked like that was a reaction that fits towards the extreme end of a scale. But do I think generally that those of us who are not seen to be racialized, although the truth is we're all racialized, it should become much, much more careful about our language? I think the answer is yes.
Okay. When I was 18, exactly 2 weeks after I turned 18, I moved into an interracial co-op in Berkeley, California, as a first-year university student. And at least half of my friends were Black. We had a boys' house and a girls' house, and we ate together and frankly slept together. And they used the word all the time. It was just part of the language. It was, just a noun.
And I said something very similar, Meta, in my conversation with my colleague. And she said to me, if I make that choice to use that word to myself or to somebody else who's Black, that's my choice. You should not have that choice. The N-word is off limits for you.
Okay. All right. Have we exhausted that subject? Or but maybe, Mary Lou, you would like to tell us a little bit about what's going on in Vienna. I'm very curious about the prospects of getting further signatories and ratifiers to the treaty. How many countries have now ratified the treaty? And what are the prospects of getting any member of a NATO country, to join it?
I'm the only Canadian parliamentarian that's here. I was supposed to be one of potentially four, but my colleagues from the House of Commons, Elizabeth May was a definite. However, they scheduled today debate on a bill that she is a top priority for her, one of her bills. And so there was just no way she could join me here. And I'm here because there is no delegation from Canada. None. There are not even, it's an unusual situation. I still can't quite figure it out. The civil society conference was on Saturday and Sunday, and there were two officials from Global Affairs Canada, one from Geneva, one from Ottawa, who were at that conference. And one of them actually offered to let me share his taxi because they already knew I was paying my own way out of my own pocket. And then the next Monday was the Humanitarian Impacts of Nuclear Weapons, a one-day conference that was open to all of the member states, the parties that up to the treaty, and any other government that wanted to come, and also lots of civil society. So pretty much everybody from civil society from the weekend came to the conference on Monday. And indeed, there was the Canada placard, and our two officials from Global Affairs Canada sat behind their Canada placard for that meeting, and then they left. So
But
for
their
the
way was
actual,
paid. They were an official delegation for just that part. Is that right?
Yes, Canada had the placard that indicated that they were a recognized delegation for that one day, and then they didn't stay. They went back to their respective cities, and yesterday, today, and tomorrow are the 3 days of the first meeting of states. In other words, the countries ratified the new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. There's no one from the Canadian government here. We've got a significant number of folks, and I'm here with a number of my youth advisors who organize themselves in community-based funding. A lot of it has come from Rotary. And so they're here with me, and they're very busy working with ICANN, the Nobel Prize laureate civil society organization. And yesterday we formed a new group called Parliamentarians for TPNW. And again, I'm the only Canadian member at this point, although I absolutely know there are other Canadian parliamentarians who will join this. And at the end of the day yesterday,
can I ask you about what the relationship is going to be between that and the other organization called PNND, Parliamentarians for Nuclear Disarmament?
Non-nuclear. The president of PN, or one of the co-chairs of the PNND, Bill Kidd from Scotland, is here. He's part of the founding group, and so this. The way that I understood it from talking to Bill was that those of us who are members already of the longer running, larger network will continue. But what we formed yesterday will be parliamentarians who are focused on trying. Most of the parliamentarians that were at this founding group, META, are from countries that have not signed or ratified the treaty.
Oh.
So we came together to try to support each other and inspire each other and provide a kind of longer running network focused on trying to find ways to have our respective countries engage. I'm not at this moment, I'm not going to talk about ratification, but I am going to keep talking about it.
Do you have a position on this? Because there's among peace activists that I know, when this happened a couple of years ago, there was a lot of conversation about whether Canada could remain part of NATO and sign the treaty. Now, one version of the answer that I heard was, yes, Canada could sign the treaty, but couldn't ratify it without having made some changes in the game plan or the strategic position of NATO. And of course, there was no real prospect that Canada would anyway, but we wanted to at least consider whether or not, because a lot of Canadians want to stay in NATO. I would say that my impression is that a big majority of Canadians want to be in NATO, but would also like to have nuclear disarmament. And so the question is, are those two positions compatible? Have they been talking about that? Have the NATO-oriented countries at the conference been discussing this question or not?
Well, I can't speak to that because I'm not in their meetings, but I can tell you that by the time we started the conference yesterday morning, we had 4 NATO countries that sent delegations of observers, which was all we were asking the Canadian government to do. Send a delegation of observers, including parliamentary observers and youth leaders. And Germany has done that, and the Netherlands has done that, and Belgium has done that. The Netherlands voted against, like actively voted against the treaty when it came up. And the fourth country, Norway. Norway was actually the first of the NATO members to say, we're sending a delegation of observers. So they're all here and they're all observing and they're interacting, and Canada's not. And when you ask about the compatibility, I think all of you, Meta and Nance and Lois, you'll all remember that it was Pierre Trudeau that actually navigated and facilitated a flexibility in NATO policy, where they went from rigidity around everyone being full out committed to nuclear weapons to allowing a formal policy within NATO that there could be a range of opinions and still maintain membership. Now, that his success has disappeared and they're back to rigidity. But where I feel the most hope is actually among the group of parliamentarians that formed yesterday, including some of the wonderful parliamentarians from Finland and Sweden, all women, all feminists, who see the TPNW, treaty is far more feminist than any of the others in the disarmament portfolio, and largely drafted, certainly with full participation by civil society. And so I had a conversation yesterday with one of the MPs from Finland, and she said, yes, we want to join NATO, of course, given what we can see with the genocide in Ukraine. But we believe that we can join NATO, and we believe that our presence in NATO, because we are a feminist government, that it will make a difference and we will be able to go back to a time when that is a more flexible policy. I suspect that the Canadian position has a lot to do with the 49th parallel. I don't know that, but I feel more hopeful today than I did 2 days ago about the ongoing work around this treaty and the vision of prohibition. With the greatest of respect for those who think we should stop at non-proliferation, could we look at the additional $6 billion spent on nuclear weapons in 2021 alone? Could we look at what is in fact proliferation, not non-proliferation? And this is part of the argument for having the Prohibition Treaty.
I have monopolized the conversation with each of you serially, but you all are friends. So why don't I just step back and say you probably have things to say to each other. Please get to it, and you feel free. I don't want to do this being a chair of a meeting or something. Nancy, what's on your mind?
Well, what's on my mind is that if the question is women in politics, and there's the question of women and politics, and they're quite different. We were all women in politics, and we're also women and politics. Mm-hmm. And as you heard me say before, I'm always concerned about the American influence, and such as Lou was just suggesting now on this nuclear thing. And, we've just plugged a bunch more money into NORAD and so on and so forth. But, if you're not in Parliament, you can't do some of the things that you're able to do. So one of the things that I was proudest of doing was having a conversation with the Auditor General at the time, who was Sheila Fraser, in an elevator one day, and asking her, would you ever do an audit on gender-based analysis? And she sort of laughed and we smiled. And I said, I'm serious. Would you ever do that? And she said, oh my goodness, my staff will not be happy if I change my mind. And I said, well, change it. And then, that was the end of that conversation. And then a few days later, I was sitting in the finance committee where she appeared, and we had a quiet word at the end of the committee. And I said, what are the things I have to do to make it possible for you to do? And she told me the 5 things I needed to do. And then probably one of the most important things was to get the House of Commons Status of Women Committee to agree to ask, to table a motion in the Commons asking the Auditor General to do this study. As a result of that, the first one was done, and I think in 2010, and there have been 3 more, including one this year, which condemns the present government for being very lazy on its GBA plus initiatives. Now, that gives documentation from an authority outside of Parliament, part of Parliament, but the Auditor General's department, to the opposition, to committees, to everybody else, to pressure ministers, deputy ministers, as they come before them as witnesses, on why they aren't doing more and what is it they're going to do. And if the parliamentarian has enough research staff, they will actually make suggestions to those deputy ministers and ministers on what they should be doing. Now, without that knowledge coming from the audit and legitimization coming from the Auditor General, those 3 audits would never have been done in the last 15 years in Canada. And if I hadn't been there and asked Sheila one day in the elevator, it would not have happened, probably. So you got to be there. And one of the problems of getting there is having enough money to run or enough clout to get appointed. Whatever way you have to go, do it. But be there. And now we're coming up to Roe versus Wade in the United States, which rather frightens me because of what happened in the truckers' stuff in the winter in Canada, and the need of our Prime Minister now to be nice. And the best position that Canada could take on this issue of abortion is no law at all. No law. And I do not want women.
Well, that's the current status, isn't it? There is no law.
Yes, it is the current status, and it's the best we can get. You make a law, someone's going to change it. That's what's happening in the USA. We do not want this. So everybody in Canada and in the United States, the way to go is no law at all.
To what extent do you feel that the public opinion in the U.S. oozes into pressure that you have experienced?
Far too much. I was just flabbergasted, especially by our national broadcaster. We pay over $1 billion a year to the CBC, and yet all their podcasts and everything else didn't ever say rights were limited. Freedoms are limited in this country. We're a different country than the USA. So having seen that, it makes me nervous. What do you think, Lois?
Well, I'd like to say something about women in politics, since I think that's supposed to be our topic. I was approached twice to run for office. Once was in Hamilton. And when I said, I was approached by the Liberals. When I said, what would you say if I wasn't a Liberal? They said, it doesn't matter, you'd win anyway. So that kind of turned me off. And then I discovered that.
Oh, I'm sorry. This was to be an MP, not a senator, right?
Yeah,
yes.
To be an MP. Yeah.
Okay. Go on.
And then they wanted to know how much money I could put into it. So, I don't have much money, so that was kind of obvious. And then, but the main impediment, I have 4 children, and there was no way I could possibly be away all week in Ottawa. There's no daycare, and I think that's a huge impediment against women. If we ever get daycare in Canada, that might help. But for women who have children, it's impossible with the setup we've got, and the money thing is a real deterrent as well. I just want to say 2 things, which is why I never ran.
Well, you mentioned, Nancy, clout as a way to, if you have the funds, you can get it to be an MP, but if you have clout, you can get appointed. Tell me what clout is like. And
it's a bit of a simplification. It's a bit of a simplification, but Lois had as I remember your story, Lois, you had contacts with the foreign minister, Lord Axworthy, at the time. And this went back for decades to your childhood. Mary Lou is probably one of the best networkers in this country. She may get othered, but she still has fantastic networks. I didn't really have networks when I went to Ottawa, except for the women's movement, but I was white. So that was an issue at the time I went to Ottawa. But you make your networks, and you make a point of getting to know the deputy ministers and cultivating the civil service, because there are not enough feminist women or women politicians to monitor what, in fact, the civil service is doing in various departments. No matter what an auditor general may have told us to watch for.
Because of my contacts, that's why I sat as an independent. I already had enough contacts, thank you. And I didn't want to spend four mornings a week in caucuses, which people told me about anyway, what happened there. And I had a particular agenda which I wanted to get done, and which I did in a limited time. But I do think that the two impediments for women are not enough money and a family.
Lois, can you tell us more about what you got done?
Well, I already said that. I mean, my major accomplishment was.
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe.
Was helping to establish a human rights committee, which they all said was not necessary at the time. It was just an extra thing, and we worked hard on that, and finally got it done, and it's there. And I wanted it structurally done because my work was to make sure that the UN covenants, which Canada signs, we're a great Boy Scout internationally, we'll sign anything. So the one on political and social rights is fine. The one on economic rights, we're not so strong on. And I wanted to have a committee that would take those two UN covenants and make sure that domestic legislation was passed to implement what we'd said we'd done internationally. I was there such a short time. All I could do was help establish the committee and do some seminars to help people understand what the issues were. I wish I'd been there longer. But in some ways, the guaranteed livable income that I'm working on now is exactly domestic legislation to implement the economic, social, and cultural UN covenants that we signed internationally, and which Mike Pearson didn't sign for some time because he knew it would have economic repercussions.
Implementation is a huge issue. It's a real problem.
My impression is that your background, Mary Lou, is also in human rights. Is that really what you're working on most of the time nowadays? You're a human rights lawyer by background, right?
I came to the Senate from being an educator in human rights, and I have an emphasis in the courses that I've developed and the writing and research that I've done on living rights. What it means that a lot of what we teach is about knowing rights, and then sometimes we go into claiming rights. But what Lois and Nance are really talking about, and Lois's reference to the international covenants, treaties, is about living your rights, and a guaranteed livable income is a big part of that. And my sense is that Kim Pate, who was also sworn in at the same time that I was, her focus still on a guaranteed livable income is unshakable. And there are other senators, Frances Lankin being another one, who've done a lot of work on this. And I mean, Kim's a young woman. She's going to have another close to 20 years in the Senate. And I think she'll never stop. She'll never give up on this. And I think there has been some progress. I'm a little surprised by how little, given the NDP Liberal agreement. This seems like an ideal time for Canada to take this step. And, maybe stuff is happening in the back channels that I don't know anything about. But in terms of the Senate's leadership, that has continued to be a top priority among a good cluster of senators working on that issue. And I think I'm certainly not alone in seeing that as a fundamental human rights issue.
Well, it's an economic right. Comes under the economic covenant.
Yes, but that's considered one of the international human rights treaties that are recognized as a cluster of international human rights. Yeah.
Nancy, how does feminism fit into human rights?
As Ursula Franklin used to say, there's no peace without justice. How does justice fit into human rights? How does feminism fit into human rights? I mean, I don't even understand the question because it's just so obvious for me. You cannot leave half the world out.
Is it hard? Do you think it's getting harder or easier for women politicians? Do you notice any changes over your lifetime? Let's not talk about the last 5 years, but over a longer period of time. Is Canada moving in a good direction?
Well, I think so. I mean, I think that it would be very difficult for John Turner to slap Ayanna Capanola on the bum anymore, and the way Sheila Cox was treated.
Uh-huh.
I mean, they were in the brunt of it. They took the brunt of it, and it's moving slowly.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that happened cooperatively amongst people of various parties, in which Mary Lou was intimately involved in, was Section 28 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which says, notwithstanding anything in this charter, the rights and freedoms are guaranteed equally to male and female persons. That whole thing, and those women together got it out from out of the override, but that whole thing is now in the courts and can be well messed up. And if we didn't have Mary Lou still on watch, we would lose part of what was fought for 40 years ago. So you got to keep your eye on it. So we're a whole lot better than we were 100 years ago.
Yeah.
But you got to keep watching.
Yeah.
And if this abortion thing turns into a law in Canada, I'm going to be beside myself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No law. No law.
I agree with everything that Lois and Nance have said on that question, Meta, but I want to just share, it's a growing realization, and I'm not finished with this yet, but I think what I've learned in the 5 years that I've been in the Senate is that this really, really isn't a male-female question, that feminism is not defined by whether you're the female or male sex or gender diverse or gender fluid. To my mind, what the real issue is the patriarchy of the institution. Mm-hmm. And my just again, speaking only for myself on this one, but I gotta say, there are women, including some young women, younger, I'm 70, younger than I am, who are defending the patriarchy of the institution.
Really?
And I don't mean they get up in the morning and say, I'm going to defend patriarchy, but I do mean that they vote, they work on issues, they actively work against some of the really strong human rights issues that some of the clearly feminist senators are working on. The work that Kim's doing around women in prison and the massively, horrendously disproportionate number of those women who are of Indigenous origin, and it's not out in the open. You can't watch what's going on when we're speaking or voting in the chamber. It's in the committees. It's in the day-to-day operations, and the patriarchy of our institution is deep, deep, deep in its DNA. And, it's a really smart strategy in a lot of ways to just go along.
And
no question.
One of those things is the Library of Parliament, who provide questions for parliamentarians to ask at committee. They claim to be neutral. They're neither conservative, liberal, or NDP, or green, or anything else. But they sure as heck aren't feminist. I mean, I can remember doing a study on North Korea when all of a sudden I asked the question, how many of the people escaping are women and how many are men? And the witness said 80% are women. That should have been in my notes, and it wasn't. What was the matter with our librarians that they didn't do that? These are people with PhDs, and they are not radical in their critical thinking at all. And that's how the patriarchy, it's one example in Parliament of how the patriarchy is upheld.
Wow, we have a whole new agenda, and maybe we better get back together and pursue that one. At any rate, we've had a good exchange. I really appreciate this, and I've enjoyed it. And bless you both, all three of you. You're wonderful. So keep it up, and I appreciate it, and carry on. Okay?
Hello.
Bye.
Toast to everyone. Big hugs to everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week, and sometimes more. This is episode number 467. You can watch these or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. And when you get there, look around. We have conversations there all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your own thoughts about the show. This is a place for dialogue. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine. You can buy a single copy or subscribe for $20 Canadian per year through PressReader. Just go to pressreader.com on your browser, and in the search bar, enter the word peace. You'll see the cover of the current issue and buttons to click to subscribe.